Hi everybody, tonight we are going to be discussing AAC for people with developmental disabilities. So first of all, an individual with a developmental disability has had this condition either present at birth or it's acquired early in life that's affected one or more areas of development. So that's what makes a condition a developmental disability as opposed to an acquired disability. And these individuals are most likely acquiring communication skills and language for the first time. Some disabilities that we're going to discuss tonight are congenital in nature, which means present at birth or shortly thereafter, intellectual disability or IDD, cerebral palsy, CP, autism spectrum disorder or ASD, and lastly, developmental apraxia of speech. So we'll first start with cerebral palsy or CP, which is a group of disorders that affects a person's ability to move and maintain balance and posture. So the big thing here is that it's the most common motor disability in childhood. So cerebral means having to do with the brain, and palsy means weakness or problems using muscles. So CP is caused by abnormal brain development or damage to the developing brain, which affects a person's ability to control his or her muscles. And this definition is from the CDC. So we do see some different characteristics. Difficulty with the motor skills is going to depend on the lesion in the brain. So typically there are two main groupings, which is spastic or non-spastic. Each has multiple variations, and it's also possible to have a mixture of both types, but I want to keep this simple because it's not a course on CP, it is about AAC. So just for you guys to know, spasticity implies increased muscle tone. So we see that muscles continually contract, it can make limbs stiff or rigid, resistant to flexing or relaxing. Dyskinetic really has to do with the specific movement. So typically movements are not coordinated, and balance and posture are typically involved. Walking gait is often very wide and it can be irregular. And then we see control of eye movements and depth perception can sometimes be impaired, which is very important to choosing an AAC system. Okay, and then just to mention that non-spastic CP is going to exhibit or decreased fluctuating muscle tone. Okay, so spastic, increased muscle tone, non-spastic is more decreased and fluctuating muscle tone. So communication impairments are common in people with CP. We see that articulation and intelligibility are affected in 38% of people, or 38% of children with CP. And language disorders are also common, and we think that this might have to do with access to language learning experiences and opportunities. So that's really interesting, and we are going to touch on that a little bit later in the presentation about how do we continue to provide language-rich experiences and opportunities for children that are using AAC systems or that do have severe disabilities. We also see intellectual disabilities in 1/3 to 2/3 of children that have CP. And visual problems, as we mentioned before, they're not uncommon. So we might see eye muscle imbalances or visual field cuts, visual perceptual problems, or loss of visual acuity. So we can certainly tackle some visual problems and challenges when we're using a high-tech AAC system. You know, we have the ability to align icons all the way to the left or all the way to the right to accommodate for that visual field cut. And when it comes to the perceptual problems or loss of visual acuity, we're thinking larger icons, changing the color schemes and themes so that the icons become more easily recognizable. So with CP, there's always a team approach to intervention because most times there are many different parts and pieces. So in the multidisciplinary team, we typically see PTs who can give practical advice on positioning and handling so that we minimize the effects of that abnormal muscle tone and we encourage the development of movement skills. PT can also advise about orthotics, wheelchairs, and other mobility aids. Now, OTs help parents to develop or help children and parents develop the child's upper limbs and some of those self-care skills. And they also can recommend suitable toys, equipment, and home adaptations, which would be important with an AAC system if you were able to link the two together. So OTs and PTs really do work nicely hand in hand with SLPs who have to assess and train and perhaps recommend the AAC systems. So think positioning, PT, access is going to be OT, and then SLPs, of course, training on the actual AAC system and software and programming and language therapy. Okay, so we often look at a multimodal communication system because with some people who have CP, they might have some natural speech. And so with familiar communication partners, they may be able to use gestures and natural speech. That's great, that's adequate. But outside of those, family members, friends, familiar communication partners, they might have the need then to use some sort of AAC system. So definitely threading the two together. And another important piece, I think, for all of the disabilities that we're going to discuss tonight is really planning for adulthood, because we're really talking about intervening and intervention when we're working with children that have these disabilities and disorders. So we want to talk about, what is college education or employment, wherever that person's skill and trajectory is. How can we plan for that? How could we customize a system, or how could we train and build upon skills so that a person is fluent with their system and can achieve some more long-term goals? So I have a video here of a child with CP using a device.
Hello, my name is Ellen.
Can you tell us a bit about how you communicate, Ellen?
I use my two switches to select the icons on my Pathfinder. When I press my right switch, a bright red light comes onto the first row of icons. If I wanted that row, then I would press my left switch to select that row. Then I have to do the same thing to select the second icon to say a word.
Do you think it's important that more people know about communication aids then and how they work?
Yeah.
Does it make it difficult for you if people don't know how you communicate?
Yeah.
So is there anything else you can do with your communication aid? What else do you use it for?
I can use my Pathfinder to control my television, and my video, and my stereo.
Okay, so what an incredible, young lady. She's certainly she's an advanced user, and it looks like she's very fluent with her system. But I did want to show you that video because it brings up the need to discuss head switches, or that alternative access. So we touched on it a bit briefly earlier in our journey together, but this is a head switch kind of in motion. So a lot of times people with CP who can't rely on their arms and their hands for that direct selection, that direct access, might need to use a head switch to control the screen, or to do some scanning there. So you'll see on the screen what a head switch kind of looks like up close. It's typically attached to a wheelchair, and this is called an arm, and then the switch here is attached to the arm, and a user will make the selection by moving their head, turning their head, and clicking on the switch. Okay. Now, what wasn't shown, but what I do want to also mention is eye gaze. So if you could see my cursor here on the screen, this is an eye gaze accessory. And there are times when the symptoms from the CP, so those motor movements, are so drastically impaired that a user might need eye gaze. Now, as we discussed, I'll go back a couple of slides, that visual problems are not uncommon. So if a user does have a visual issue, whether it's an eye muscle imbalance or loss of visual acuity, anything along those lines, they might not be a good candidate. But this is certainly an alternative way to access and make selections other than using your hand and arms if you do have a motor movement disorder. Now, the other thing to consider is the need to assess for cognitive or receptive language impairments. As we know, sometimes you might see intellectual disability in 1/3 to 2/3 of people that have CP. So if that's the case, then we might need to think about modifying the symbols, right, or changing the layout. We're going to talk a little bit more about how we can approach therapeutically children and people who have these developmental disabilities, that we still have the need to teach and learn language, and how we can arrange the layout and the symbols to assist with that. Okay, so now we're going to move on to intellectual disability, which is certainly separate from CP, but people who have CP may also have an intellectual disability, although they are separate. I feel like you guys know that, but it's worth it to make mention. Now, here's a definition from the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. So an intellectual disability is a disability characterized by significant limitations in both intellectual functioning and in adaptive behavior. And adaptive behavior covers everyday social and practical skills. And the disability typically originates before the age of 18. So that's another important piece of info there. So what is intellectual functioning anyway? So we know it as intelligence, but it refers to the general mental capacity, which is learning, reasoning, problem solving, and so on. And we measure intellectual functioning typically through an IQ test. So an IQ test score of around 70, or it can be as high as 75, actually can indicate some limitation in intellectual functioning. Okay. Now let's look a little bit further at adaptive behavior, which is a collection of conceptual, social, and practical skills. And these are learned and performed by people in their everyday lives. So if we break that down a little bit further, conceptual skills, if you think language and literacy, also money and time, numbers, concepts, and self-direction. Social skills, which I think a lot of us are very familiar with, but those are going to be our interpersonal skills, our social responsibility, self-esteem, social problem solving, etc. Now, our practical skills, those are activities of daily living or personal care. They can be our occupational skills, or how do we take care of ourselves, our health care. Travel and transportation, so how we get ourselves from place A to place B. Schedules, routines, our safety awareness, our use of the money and use of the telephone. And we do have standardized tests that can determine any limitations in adaptive behavior. Okay, so what are some good effective teaching methods for people that have intellectual disabilities? Well, the first thing we want to do is break down AAC learning into small steps. So each learning task is introduced one step at a time, and this really avoids overwhelming individuals. So once the individual has mastered one step, then we introduce the next step. And this is a progressive, stepwise learning approach. It's really the main characteristic of many different learning models, but the only difference here when we're thinking about people who have intellectual disabilities is the number and size of the sequential steps. Now, the second strategy is to modify our teaching approach. So sometimes lengthy verbal directions or abstract lectures are ineffective at teaching. So, and most of us are kinesthetic learners, so very hands-on. And this might be the case when we're working with a person who has an intellectual disability. They might do best by actually performing the task. So we model, and then we have them, use the AAC system. And obviously, everybody learns best when information is concrete and observed. So I think visual aids are important to consider as well. We want to use a lot of actual photographs as our symbols, and sometimes not just actual photographs, but an actual picture of an image that exists in someone's everyday life. So not a picture of a water bottle, but the picture of my water bottle that I take with me every day to work. And if nothing else that you take away from, I think, this entire course, it's that it's so important to train communication partners to assist with AAC systems and help facilitate conversations. So it takes two to tango. A conversation involves two people at minimum, right? Unless we're talking to ourselves, which certainly happens. We all have internal dialogue that sometimes becomes external. But certainly training communication partners is very, very helpful at getting a person that has an intellectual disability to use their device effectively. So here's a study, Romsky and Sevcik. Hope I pronounced that correctly. But there's data from studies, particularly adolescents with intellectual disabilities, which have suggested that the use of SGDs contributes to gains in receptive and expressive communication. So we certainly have this data, generally speaking, with SGDs, but here it is pertaining specifically to people with intellectual disability. So this does help with receptive and expressive communication. Okay, we're moving on now to autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. There is a pretty lengthy criteria. And again, this is not a course necessarily designed to kind of go in depth into each disorder. So please feel free to read more into ASD and the other disorders that we discussed tonight. This is just kind of a very general sense so that we can get into the considerations. And we need to also note as we go through this that every individual, every child presents differently, and we really want to be tackling the the characteristics of that unique individual, their specific needs. Okay, so autism spectrum disorder is a complex developmental disability. Signs typically appear during early childhood, and it affects a person's ability to communicate and interact with others. So ASD is defined by a certain set of behaviors and is a spectrum condition which affects individuals differently and to varying degrees. So that's why I say there are, you know, this set of behaviors that you guys, I certainly encourage you to read up into it if you don't already know. Okay, so some of the behaviors associated with autism include delayed learning of language, difficulty making eye contact or holding conversation, difficulty with executive functioning, which relates to reasoning and planning, intense or narrow interests. Sometimes we see poor motor skills and sensory sensitivities. So some students have no functional communication, while others might just have fragmented communication and conversations. We know that there are some students on the spectrum that might demonstrate echolalia, right, which is when I repeat over and over what I might have heard, like an echo. But regardless of the situation, AAC is going to provide a student with access to communicating with others in a universally understood way. And of course, that's going to enhance independence. So a couple of considerations here when using an AAC system is that we definitely want to thread the social component of interactions and conversations with the communication and with the system. And we want to also always address the receptive and expressive language impairments. So there is a ton of research out there on AAC and ASD. I have some of the articles up here. We'll start with PECS. So picture communication symbols have been successfully used to reduce problem behaviors, increase on-task responses. It's also been a proven effective strategy for facilitating imitation, very important, increasing frequency of the interactions or initiations, responses, comments, and decreasing problem behaviors again. Now, SGDs, or speech generating devices, so that's going to be different than PECS, has furnished a voice to many individuals through SGDs, so pre-linguistic communication behaviors in adolescents with autism have also been successfully substituted for more symbolic communication when the speech-generating devices were introduced. Okay, and the use of SGDs as a component to computer-assisted instruction, or CAI, was effective at promoting vocabulary acquisition and word retention, as well as increasing verbalizations and vocal imitation. So this is obviously important when we're thinking about our nonverbal clients that have ASD, and thinking about what system to choose, and or just how important AAC is to people's lives. Okay, so we have another video here which is not linked, so you'll have to bear with me one moment. Okay, we don't want Ellen. We viewed her. Here we go. And it was okay.
Bless you.
Carla. It's yeah, Carlos' turn. You good, Sherry? Carlos, what do you want?
Who is it? Who is that? Mommy. You see the doggy in the window? Okay.
What do you want? We don't have bed. We have couch, or we have couch. Oh, couch. Good job.
Look at what's this?
Look, what did you find?
Carlos.
Carlos.
Couch. Couch.
Yeah. Ball.
And then mommy.
Ball. Yay. Good job.
Yeah, that's dog.
Good job, Nolan. Look, Carlos. Nolan's turn. Look, it's Nolan's turn. Get to Nolan.
Quiet, Bonnie. Hand to Nolan, please.
Tell me, what do you want?
Good.
Couch. Oh, no ball.
Carlos, quiet, Bonnie. Quiet, Bonnie.
It's good job. Carlos, what do you want to open?
Toy. New toy?
Which one?
What is that?
Look, we have
First,
stove or
first pick one,
seat.
then you get.
Carlos, come back. Do you want bathroom?
Oh, because he earned it.
Oh.
Okay. So one moment. Take me a moment to get the presentation back up. Okay, so one thing I really like about this video and I want to discuss with you guys is how the therapist threaded in the pragmatic or social component. So we certainly saw the child using the systems. That was a child who was on the autism spectrum. So we saw him using the high-tech system or the SGD to make choices. But what we also saw was, okay, it's your turn, it's Nolan's turn. So there was a multimodal communication system. It was high tech, and then we saw the low tech, right? Just the pictures and the schedule. So I really like that video, and I think that it really covers all the important parts and pieces when it comes to children on the spectrum using AAC. Here are just a few more considerations for AAC use. We want to start early. Early intervention is very important, actually, just kind of across many different disorders. But there are 6 main areas. So we think functional spontaneous communication using verbal or AAC modalities. Number 2, we want to develop developmentally appropriate social skills with parents and peers. The 3rd area is play skills. The 4th area is creating various goals to kind of target that cognitive development. The 5th area are positive behavioral supports. And then the 6th area is functional academic skills where appropriate. So again, highlighting how important it is to address pragmatics or that social communication with the device. And the AAC systems are going to provide an active means to communication, which we know, and that tends to improve verbal speech. So the process of learning the meaning of one word and then increasing the single word vocabulary, combining words together to make phrases and sentences, really help children with autism reach that goal of being independent and having a little bit more spontaneous communication. And we know that the auditory output of high-tech AAC devices provide that sensory feedback to help the child develop his or her receptive and expressive language skills. Okay. All right, so the next disorder that we're going to talk about is childhood apraxia of speech, which is a motor speech disorder or speech sound disorder. And we know that it is not caused by weakness or paralysis of the speech muscles. It is a we hear distorted sound production. One key feature is there are inconsistent errors in speech. You will see groping for sounds, so the mouth appears to be groping or struggling. And there are errors in tone, stress, or rhythm, so the way that they sound. Now, the severity can really vary from person to person, child to child. So it can be so mild that it causes trouble with only a few speech sounds or with the pronunciation of words that have many syllables. Or in the most severe cases, someone with childhood apraxia of speech might not be able to communicate effectively by speaking. So they just might need to rely solely on an AAC system. But AAC is actually considered a secondary intervention. Usually the primary focus is on improving natural speech. Now this can cause a problem just as far as we might see language delays with a child that has apraxia of speech, but this is just because all the intervention and emphasis is on the improving the natural speech. So there becomes limitations in the language opportunities, right? So that's why AAC can be important. So, we want to always give that communication modality, the AAC system, for the purposes of language development. So as they're working on their speech, they still have access to participate in the different interactions that children do. Okay, so we know that using language interactively leads to communicative competence, but there are some challenges when children are learning language, but they are also relying on an AAC system. So I just wanted to break down a couple of areas here and talk about why it becomes a challenge. So semantics is understanding how words relate to one another. So the examples here of pin, pan, and pen. We know that these are different words, different objects, and therefore they have different meanings. And for children learning semantics and using an AAC system, the input for their learning is speech. So they hear pin, pan, and pen, but their output, so how they're going to communicate the differences in those words and differences with, when it comes to semantics, is symbols. So input is speech. I'm learning because somebody's instructing me via speech, but my output needs to be symbols. So then syntax, which is the rules that we have for putting words together in sentences, this can become a challenge because the prevalence of simple clauses have very limited use of complex structures like questions, commands, negatives, and auxiliary verbs on the system, right? And oftentimes we see omission of words. It's just easier for me to hit water instead of I'd like a drink of water right now, which is the rules for putting all of the sentence, putting all the words together into a sentence, excuse me. So yeah, what we tend to see is extensive use of this multimodal combination, or just compensating for the lack of needed symbols. So we see gesture symbol, vocalization symbol. So I push water, but I'm gesturing for, drink of water, or now, I'm tapping my hand on a desk or on a table, water now. Or sometimes we see the word overextensions, which means, I can't find the symbol for cow right now. I'm going to use the word dog or animal, right? So just overextending the word. And that, again, is likely a compensation for the lack of the needed symbols, or they just can't find them. So what language researchers have proposed is that error patterns may be due to the asymmetry or the differences between what AAC users hear, so that spoken language or that input, and then how they communicate with others. The output is the AAC system. Okay, now when it comes to morphology, which we know are the rules for building and changing words, just as a refresher, I put up there, you know, pin versus pins. We know pin is going to be singular. Pins, I have a bunch of pins. Walk versus walked, those have, you know, it changes the word. When I add ed to the word walk, that means I've walked in the past. So omitting morphemes and choosing efficiency over accuracy is a strategy that enhances the rate, enhances speech for communication. Oftentimes we see again that symbols are just, the symbols that they need are just not available or readily available on the display. Or that the AAC modality precludes the need for these conventional morphemes. So that was actually, there was a study done there. They specifically looked at PECs. So with the PEC system, there actually aren't a lot of opportunities to utilize morphemes. That's kind of not what the system is used for, and that's not what it's about. So pragmatics we see also becomes a challenge. So that's the rules for using language contextually for social purposes. You know, this is just something that we as clinicians need to continually reinforce. Turn taking, initiating, greetings, social etiquette, all of that threading with pragmatics, because it becomes mostly about responses and requests. So, you know, I ask an AAC user, you know, what do you want to eat? And they are just responding, or they're asking, you know, or requesting for a type of food. There's not a whole lot of initiation in conversation. So that small talk that we discussed, which is so important to all of our conversations, sometimes is lacking in early AAC users and intervention. Okay, so how do we translate spoken language into visual representation or symbols? So we need to consider the appropriate symbols and language. You know, do we need to integrate manual signs, photographs, pictures, digital images, etc.? It's important to consider how to translate what a child is hearing into the symbols. So how do we represent walked with the ed on it, past tense, from walk, I walk? So that's kind of point number one. Number two, thinking about organization of the system, because we want to promote maximal efficiency and effective communication. So that was back to that problem there, is just as far as maybe not having easy access to the needed symbols and just compensating. And so therefore, you know, we're not getting that syntax and the semantics. So we have different grid displays, and we also have visual or contextual scenes. So different ways to organize. The first one we'll talk about is semantic syntactic grid display, which is going to organize vocabulary according to the part of speech and its relationship within the syntactic framework. Okay, so this is really intended to facilitate that language learning. And I will pass along the Fitzgerald key, so that makes a little bit more sense to you guys. Now there's also the taxonomic grid display, which involves grouping icons according to categories. So there's a category for places, then a category for people, feelings, foods, etc. Then there's the activity grid, which organizes into event schemes, routines, or activities. So maybe I have morning, noon, night. Lastly, we have the pragmatic organization dynamic display. So this is basically a grid display which supports communication for different functions. Efficient communication is the overriding factor, which determines that selection and organization and also placement in the system. And then the visual scenes or contextual scenes is just when we take all of the vocabulary and we put it into context. So that's something that you guys had a chance to play around with in our hands-on workshop. And then lastly, hybrid displays, which combined all of the above or some of the above. The other thing we want to consider are our instructional approaches. So you might have already heard me say this during this course together, but it's very important to stay in communication mode versus test mode, and to train our communication partners and caregivers to always stay in communication mode with the device. So as a refresher, communication mode when I'm instructing using the device is a lot like the YouTube videos that we've had the opportunity to view. I'm modeling with the device. I might be, showing the user where to click, where to hit an icon, how to use the system, but it's all in communication mode. It's in a natural flow of a game or an activity or a conversation. Test mode is just basically asking users to click on icons upon command. So click the apple, hit the banana, where's the cat? That's staying in test mode. Whereas if we open up a page and instead of saying click the banana, click the apple, we open up the fruit page and we ask somebody, so tell me, what's your favorite fruit? Mine is strawberry, and I click strawberry to model how to use this device in communication and in conversation. Okay, so that concludes this lecture for tonight. I am looking forward to touching base with you guys again soon. So please complete the discussion forum that you'll find on Blackboard, and we will speak again soon. Please let me know if you guys have any questions about the material that we covered today or any of the supplemental material that I've provided.